Right now, as you are watching this, atmospheric scientists at NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, the UK Met Office, and the European ECMWF are all looking at the same instrument readouts, and what they are seeing, 30 kilometers above the North Pole, in a layer of the atmosphere that most people have never thought about, is unusual enough that all three agencies use the word elevated in coordinated advisories issued on August 16, 2026. That layer is the stratosphere. Specifically, the stratospheric polar vortex, a vast rotating mass of extremely cold air that forms over the Arctic each autumn, spins up through the winter, and normally holds the coldest air on the planet plucked. Over the pole, where it does not bother anyone, the vortex is invisible from the surface. Its behavior is measured by radiosondes launched from Arctic weather stations, by satellite instruments looking down at the tops of the atmosphere, and by the ensemble weather models that assimilate all of that data into forecasts of what the vortex is likely to do in the weeks ahead. For most of the past decade, the polar vortex has behaved unremarkably in August. It is barely present. It is not yet fully formed for the coming winter. And August signals about winter vortex behavior have generally been noise. But over the past 3 weeks, a specific pattern of anomalous stratospheric wave activity has emerged that closely matches the precursor signature that preceded the sudden stratospheric warming events of January 2021. In February 2018, the two most consequential polar vortex disruptions of the modern satellite era, and the two events whose downstream weather ultimately killed hundreds of people, cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and rewrote every serious utility company's understanding of what cold weather can do to an underprepared grid. The August 16th advisories are careful. They do not predict a specific event. They do not name a date. Winter weather forecasting on the timescale of months is not that precise, and the honest scientists issuing these statements say so directly. What the advisories communicate is that a signal has appeared, that the signal resembles previous precursors to strong polar vortex disruptions, and that the coming winter has an elevated probability of producing at least one major sudden stratospheric warming event, which historically translates into extreme cold outbreaks, reaching deep into mid-latitude populated areas of North America, Europe, or East Asia. Today we break down exactly what the polar vortex is and why the stratosphere 30 kilometers above your head can decide whether your February is normal or unprecedented, what a sudden stratospheric warming actually is at the physical level, and how it converts a stable polar vortex into a mid-latitude cold catastrophe, why the specific signal detected this month is being described as different from the ordinary variability. The two events that show precisely what a well-prepared response to this pattern looks like versus a catastrophically unprepared one, and what you should actually do with a warning that arrives 4 to 5 months ahead of the events it may produce. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the atmospheric science, the record, and the real stakes. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? And do you remember February 2021, the week Texas froze, Houston's water system failed, 246 people died in a state that had almost no functional preparation for extreme cold? Or do you remember late February and early March of 2018 in the UK and Europe, the Beast from the East event that closed schools, buried cars in snowdrifts, and delivered one of the coldest weeks in a generation? Tell me your country and what you remember, because those two events are the direct downstream effects of the class of polar vortex disruption the current signal is warning about, and they show what preparation is worth when it works and what its absence costs when it does not. Subscribe right now if you want every stratospheric outlook, every polar vortex development, and every major winter weather forecast covered as it evolves through the coming months, completely free. A thumbs up puts this in front of people who deserve 4 months of warning instead of 4 days. Let us go for 6,000 likes now. Let us go up 30 kilometers, because that is where this story starts. The atmosphere is layered. The layer we live in, the troposphere, extends from the surface up to roughly 10 to 12 kilometers in the mid-latitudes, and it is where essentially all of the weather that affects human life takes place. Above the troposphere sits the stratosphere, extending from roughly 12 kilometers up to about 50 kilometers, characterized by air that gets warmer with altitude rather than colder, and containing the ozone layer that protects the surface from ultraviolet radiation. For most of the 20th century, scientists treated the stratosphere as effectively separate from surface weather, a layer that existed but did not really interact with the day-to-day meteorology below it. That understanding changed decisively over the past 3 decades, as observations and modeling made clear that the stratosphere and the troposphere are dynamically coupled, and that events in the stratosphere can propagate downward to reshape surface weather patterns for weeks to months at a time. The polar vortex is a central character in that coupling. Each autumn, as the Arctic loses sunlight, the air over the pole cools dramatically, and the temperature difference between the pole and the mid-latitudes strengthens. This difference drives a powerful westerly circulation around the pole at stratospheric heights, the polar vortex that reaches its full strength in midwinter. A strong, tightly organized polar vortex acts like a lid on the Arctic. It confines the coldest air masses to the high latitudes, and the mid-latitude jet stream below runs in relatively straight, west-to-east patterns that produce ordinary winter weather. A weak or disrupted polar vortex acts like an open lid. The confined cold air spills out. The jet stream develops massive waves, Arctic air masses that would normally stay over Siberia, or Nunavut, in January instead, pour southward into Texas, into the deep south, into Central Europe, into Eastern Asia. The mid-latitude jet stream, no longer holding a stable west-to-east track, forms deep meridional loops that can lock in place for weeks, delivering extended cold snaps to areas whose infrastructure was designed for milder conditions. The mechanism that most reliably disrupts the polar vortex is called a sudden stratospheric warming, or SSWs. SSWs happen when large-scale planetary waves in the troposphere propagate upward into the stratosphere, deposit their energy into the vortex, and disturb its stable rotation. In a major SSW, the temperature over the pole at stratospheric heights can jump by 30 to 50 degrees Celsius in a matter of days. Hence, the sudden and the warming in the name. The vortex weakens, splits into two, or reverses direction entirely, and within 1 to 4 weeks of the stratospheric event, the effects propagate down into the troposphere, and the mid-latitude weather pattern reorganizes into exactly the kind of Arctic outbreak configuration that turns ordinary winter into extraordinary crisis. Now, what is the August signal, and why is it different? The stratospheric wave activity being observed over the past 3 weeks is characterized by an unusual pattern of vertical energy propagation from the troposphere into the developing polar vortex, energy that appears to be arriving earlier than typical and with a spectral signature that historically correlates with subsequent SSW occurrence. This is not itself an SSW. SSWs happen in midwinter, not August. What the current signal indicates is that the stratosphere is entering the winter season with elevated wave activity in exactly the pattern that has, in past years, made subsequent SSW events more likely, combined with the ongoing La Niña-based state, which we covered in our weather shift video and which historically correlates with more variable polar vortex behavior. The coming winter is being flagged by NOAA, CPC, and the Met Office as carrying an elevated probability of at least one strong SSW event. The reason the advisories use the word different is specific. The previous August timeframe stratospheric outlooks have carried larger uncertainty margins and less consistent model agreement. The current signal shows a rare convergence. Multiple independent stratospheric analysis systems run at NOAA, at the Met Office, at ECMWF, at the German DWD, all detecting the same pattern with the same intensity in the same location. That kind of multi-agency convergence is what elevated the language of the coordinated statement. It is still not a prediction of a specific date. It is a scientifically honest heightening of the probability of an event, whose historical downstream consequences justify the 4 months of warning. Now let us talk about what those downstream consequences look like, because the contrast between the two most recent major SSW-driven Arctic outbreaks is the entire argument for what preparation is worth when this signal fires. In January 2021, a major sudden stratospheric warming disrupted the polar vortex. Over the following 2 weeks, the vortex split, and cold Arctic air poured southward across North America. Beginning February 10th, an Arctic air mass unprecedented in Texas history extended south to the Rio Grande. Temperatures in Dallas dropped to minus 18 degrees Celsius. Houston received a hard freeze that lasted days. And the electric grid operated by ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, began to fail. Natural gas wellheads froze because they had not been winterized for the temperatures the pattern was delivering. Gas-fired power plants lost fuel, wind turbines froze, coal piles froze, the grid frequency dropped to within roughly 4 minutes of a cascading collapse that would have taken weeks to recover from. To avoid that collapse, ERCOT ordered rolling blackouts that became not rolling as the emergency deepened. Millions of Texans lost power for days. Water systems failed as pipes burst and pumps lost power. People burned furniture for warmth in their homes, and people died. 246 confirmed deaths in the state of Texas alone, primarily from hypothermia and carbon monoxide poisoning from improvised heating attempts. Though independent analyses have argued the true excess mortality was significantly higher, estimated economic damage, approximately $196 billion. The February 2021 Texas cold event happened in a state whose infrastructure had been repeatedly warned that its lack of winterization was a serious vulnerability, most notably in a 2011 report following an earlier, less severe cold event. Those warnings were not acted upon at scale. When the SSW-driven Arctic outbreak arrived, it found infrastructure that had been designed for a climate that did not include this event. The result was one of the deadliest weather disasters in modern American history. Now look at the United Kingdom in late February and early March of 2018. A major SSW in mid-February 2018 disrupted the polar vortex over Europe, and by February 22nd, forecasters at the Met Office were issuing advisories about a coming extreme cold event they had named the Beast from the East. The event arrived. Temperatures across the UK dropped to minus 12 degrees in some areas. Heavy snowfall closed thousands of schools. The M80 motorway in Scotland became famously stranded, with vehicles trapped in. Drifts for many hours. Rail networks suspended services. Airports closed. Roughly 17 people died across the UK during the event, primarily from cold exposure, road accidents, and cardiac events triggered by cold. The UK's death toll from the same category of stratospheric event, delivered against a population of comparable size to Texas, but in a country with infrastructure genuinely designed for winter weather, was approximately 1/15 of Texas's toll. That difference is not accidental. It reflects a public health system prepared to identify and support cold vulnerable populations, an energy grid designed for winter conditions, a transport authority experienced with snow closures, and a population with cultural experience of severe winters. The Beast from the East was a genuinely severe event, and it killed people. But the death toll was contained by systems that had been built over decades to handle exactly this. Class of hazard, Texas 2021 and UK 2018 are the two poles of what an SSW-driven Arctic outbreak means for a population. Same category of atmospheric event, same fundamental physics, opposite outcomes on the ground because of the state of the infrastructure and the preparation the outbreak arrived to test. The August 16, 2026 signal is a warning that this class of event has an elevated probability of occurring somewhere in the mid-latitude northern hemisphere this winter. The specific location, where it's hardest, which country, which state, which region, cannot be predicted this far in advance. What can be predicted is that if it does hit, the difference between a Texas-style outcome and a UK-style outcome will be exactly the difference in what the affected region has done in the preceding months to prepare for it. Let us be direct about the practical message, because information without action is just anxiety. For utility operators, grid managers, and infrastructure agencies in the mid-latitudes, this advisory is the 4-month notice to complete winterization audits and verify natural gas fuel security for winter generation. Stress test emergency load shedding protocols, and ensure that whatever lessons were technically absorbed from Texas 2021 are actually operationalized before December. The window between an August signal and a February event is exactly the window that responsible institutions use to prepare. Waiting until the SSW itself appears in real time removes most of that window. For governments and emergency management agencies, cold weather preparation planning should include verified operational shelters for cold vulnerable populations, communication systems that can reach elderly and isolated residents when heating fails, and clear coordination between utilities, public health, and emergency response ahead of the season. Texas 2021 killed the elderly, the medically fragile, and the housing insecure, disproportionately. Every one of those categories is identifiable, and the response can be pre-planned rather than improvised in the middle of the event. For individuals in mid-latitude regions, this is the year to make sure you have functional cold weather protocols in your home. Understand how to shelter in place safely without power. Never use unvented combustion for heating indoors. The carbon monoxide fatalities in Texas 2021 were mostly people running generators inside enclosed spaces or grilling indoors. Insulate exposed pipes. Know your household's most cold vulnerable member and plan around them. And if you live in a region with limited winter experience, a place where hard freezes are rare, do not assume rare means impossible. The SSW does not care about your region's climate history when it delivers Arctic air. Final thought. 30 kilometers above the North Pole, in a layer of the atmosphere most people will never think about, a signal has appeared that suggests the coming winter carries an elevated probability of the specific type of extreme cold. Outbreak that killed 246 Texans in a single week 5 years ago and 17 Britons 3 years before that in a country that was ready for it. The signal is not a prediction of a specific event. It is a scientifically honest 4-month warning that the category of event has an elevated probability of arriving somewhere in the northern mid-latitudes this winter, delivered by an unusual convergence of independent international forecasting systems. What is different about this warning is not that the vortex might disrupt. Vortex disruptions have happened many times in the observational record. What is different is that the signal has appeared with a clarity and multi-model agreement that gives responsible institutions actionable time to prepare. Texas 2021 happened without adequate preparation because the warnings had been ignored for years. The UK 2018 event killed 17 people instead of 246 because a country had done its work. In advance, the next SSW-driven Arctic outbreak, wherever it hits, will write its own death toll. And the difference between the two categories of outcome will be exactly what happens in the 4 months between now and when the vortex actually breaks. The atmospheric science has done its part. The warning is out. The countries, states, utilities, and households that hear it and act on it will have very different Februaries than those that dismiss it as too abstract to matter. And that choice this time is happening in August with time. We will track every stratospheric outlook, every polar vortex development, and every downstream signal from this pattern through the entire coming winter. Subscribe so you do not miss it, and leave that comment, your country, your memory of past cold events, and whether this warning is on your radar, because a signal that arrives with time only matters if the time is used. 6,000 likes. Let us go.